Pokemon collecting and investing has surged in popularity. In fact, the search term Pokemon investing on Google Trends literally exploded ever since 2024. And with that, there's been a lot of interest in the hobby, as collectors have now noticed that their favorite Pokemon cards can appreciate over time. Though here's the thing, Pokemon has gone through a natural progression point where, collectors have grown up. And all of us who were kids when we collected in the late 90s and early 2000s, and even in the 2010s, well, we all now have adult money. And honestly, a lot of us are still, big kids ourselves, and I think collectors purchasing Pokemon cards has become a real engaging hobby for a lot of us. The fact that Pokemon collectibles can increase and decrease in price just naturally makes it addictive to follow. And one thing I've noticed is people who start collecting get a little bit consumed with it. And if I were to paint the average entry point, of how people start collecting Pokemon cards, it usually comes with a lot of research and then a lot of money spent in a short amount of time. But as much as people enter the hobby, some people can also leave. And that's why I do want to speak about the first prediction for 2026, which is expect certain collectors to move on. This is one thing that, people aren't really speaking about that much, but as quick as a lot of new collectors can enter the hobby, they can also leave the same way. The thing is, when people enter Pokemon cards and start collecting, like I mentioned, there's a big amount of research. The usual journey, and I'll tell you my journey, it was going through older cards that I used to have as a kid, and then looking at newer sets, researching pull rates, researching all this information, watching so many people online, reading so many articles, and then you'll find a cool card and you'll be like, oh, I want that in my collection. And you start buying and just something that before this you would have said, hey, I never would have spent more than $50 or even $30 on something like Pokemon cards. But out of nowhere, some people, they can spend, $500, $1,000 on Pokemon cards in such a short amount of time. And you just got consumed. It's almost like you got bitten by the collecting bug. And that's the formula of how it works. I've just noticed, it really consumes you, especially early on. I think when you collect for a longer period of time, you kind of learn hey, there's hype waves. There's, people get kind of like sucked into how things kind of are going to perform. People get sucked into a lot of things, and then you kind of take a bit more of a spectator view while you're still playing the game. But, when those early days, they can be fun, but they can also be a bit dangerous because, a lot of people overspend on these cards. And that's why I do think a lot of collectors will begin moving on, because if some people are in the hobby for the wrong reasons, which is, this endless, linear growth where you buy something, early in the year, and then by the end of that year, it's tripled in price, and they think and they have this idea that that's how the hobby is just meant to work, then these people will leave. A lot of people who enjoy collecting and have that connection, or it reminds them of times of their childhood, or it does something, or it's a social aspect, a lot of those people are going to stay. And that's why I do think this shift in 2026 will be happening. Whether or not this is going to have a big impact, it just depends, because I do think Pokemon collecting in a way has quite high churn. And what I mean by that is I do think a lot of people enter the hobby and I think a lot of people leave. I think, one of the things about 2025 was that a lot of people entered the hobby in that year. So many people entered and not enough people were kind of leaving out. Though now I do think in 2026, I think we're going to have a more healthy flow. You're still going to have a lot of people enter, but I do think some people will just move on to other things. And that of course will help a lot of things such as prices, such as, the kind of people who are in the hobby, and of course also how to learn the hobby as well. Now, before we jump further into the video, if you do love buying and selling Pokemon cards, then I do want to give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Misprint. Now, Misprint is a US-based marketplace built entirely around the Pokemon community. Now, what's so cool about Misprint is that every listing comes straight from the community, so you get real-time market prices. Misprint has a range of products, including sealed product, slabs, and a huge library of singles to choose from. Now, one thing I personally love about Misprint is their unique buy now and sell now feature. Here, you can actually place in the exact price you'd be willing to pay for an item. Now, if the market ever hits that chosen number that you've placed, the purchase or even the sale happens automatically. Now, if you do download the Misprint app, it actually becomes super handy, especially at card shows. Here, you can scan multiple PSA slabs at the same time, and it instantly shows you the current market value of them. Now, if you want to try Misprint for yourself, you can actually use my referral code and get $5 off your first purchase. A big thanks to to Misprint for supporting the channel. Now let's jump back into this video. I think one thing that a lot of people kind of, especially in the content creation space, a lot of people go, hey, Phil, how did your channel grow, right? Or like, how did it grow? And one of the things is like, I think my videos are good and like they're entertaining and you can easily watch them and you can connect with me as a person. And I kind of try to have that kind of real and open discussion with a lot of you. But I also, I'm not going to lie to you and say that like I'm just some guru and everything just worked out in my favor. I mean, there was a bit of luck for me as well because, like I showed you in that Google Trends chart before, I was making content before that massive boom. And, I was talking a lot about Pokemon investing. And this is when Pokemon investing was still a bit more of a quiet kind of term in a way. Like it wasn't that kind of, not many people were that interested in it just as of yet. It was a bit more of a small niche crowd, right? By the time that, I started making content, I was already making content for like 6-7 months at that point, and that's when Pokemon investing started really picking up in popularity. And by the time, the end of 2024, a lot of people started talking about Pokemon investing. So because of that, I was kind of in content creation at a very good time as well. Of course, I don't want to be like taking that away and just saying, hey, I was just in it at the right time. But, I think that a lot of things kind of worked in my favor as well. And I think Pokemon investing is going to be here to stay. I think it does get a bit more of a bad rep than it kind of needs. I think the idea of Pokemon investing and how it kind of started and what people kind of thought of it made more sense, especially back then, because a lot of there's a lot of us who started doing this, figuring out Pokemon investing. A lot of us knew that, hey, these collectibles that we purchase over a long period of time, back then it was like if you waited like 2 years, they would start climbing in price and they would start performing pretty well. And of course, now the mainstream really has caught on to this and it's become a very big thing. And that's why, as long as if people just expect this endless growth and very quick growth, those people and those collectors will move out of the hobby because, they're just thinking, hey, it's just not, why are my Pokemon cards coming down in price? But, I don't want to really use that word, the real fans, but more the collectors who have been here or actually enjoy Pokemon collecting as a whole will be here to stay and they won't really be bothered about, the big price swings. Now, by the way, I just want to say, if you have been enjoying the video, my name is Phil and I've been running this Pokemon collecting and investing channel for about 2 years now. Definitely feel free to subscribe for consistent updates. Now, the second area to discuss, expect certain chase cards to become pretty attainable as 2026 continues. One thing that you learn quick, when a new set comes out, a lot of hype, a lot of media attention, a lot of people care about the new cards releasing. It is fun, there's so much exciting cards coming out and people really look at those cards and they get kind of excited, everyone's talking about them. Then you see people like, talking about how they're overpaying on it, the market kind of blows up, and you have to kind of work out if there's a hype period as well or if there isn't. And that's why I do think in 2026, a lot of the chase cards we've seen throughout the years will start dipping. One thing people forget is even though something might be hyped at a certain period, can that hype period last a long period of time? Iron Crown Special Illustration Rare was once the top chase card of Scarlet and Violet. Sure, we were only 3 sets in at that point, but still, it was once the most hyped card. It was even more hyped than the Magikarp Illustration Rare, which is kind of wild to say out loud now because Iron Crown, that has no kind of pull power compared to the Magikarp. But that's the thing that happens. In that hype period, the Iron Crown was very much in demand. Once it left, it became much more quiet and down. And that's how the hobby works. And it's very important if you are collecting or if you are purchasing Pokemon cards that you kind of do wait and, let time do its thing. If you wait 6 months or even 8 months to purchase a single chase card, a lot of things start working in your favor. And take this from me because I've overspent on Pokemon cards, regretted some purchases, and even though I can say, oh, I regret some purchases, so some people be like, but Phil, do you regret the purchase now even though they've climbed in price? And this is where you kind of have to refine your thinking when you think of that. I bought a lot of Pokemon cards, I spent probably more than I should have at that time. Now, one of the issues was I spent a lot of that money, but the thing is I was putting, buying Pokemon cards over a lot of other things, and that was a bad decision I did. Now, the reason why, whether or not a Pokemon card grows or doesn't grow, that's not actually the point. What's far more important is if you're buying cards when you have the means to do so. Now, this is from the book, The Psychology of Money, and I'd really recommend this book to anyone who cares about, finances or anything in terms of saving money in any of that kind of field, because it goes in the psychology of whenever you purchase something or invest in anything, okay? And the real key area is never kind of purchase something and put yourself in a difficult position because of some future scenario that may or may not happen. I've used this example in previous videos, but I think it's a really good example to, tell my audience. There was a time around 2 years ago that I could have bought 2 Fusion Strike cases, for retail price. They were very affordable during this time. I personally thought it was a really good decision. Though, if I did want to buy 2 cases, I would really have to either, take that money from savings or, take it in another way and potentially put myself or my family in a bit of a difficult decision because I thought, hey, Fusion Strike is going to climb in price. Instead, I just bought 2 booster boxes. Now, when I'm looking at that today, Fusion Strike's obviously grown so much in price. Obviously, buying the 2 cases was a great decision back then. But the key thing and the key lesson here, and what we kind of has to be understood, even though it was a good decision, at that time, it wasn't a good decision because it would have overstretched me. And that's why it's really important, because hindsight's 2020. I can look at prices from, years ago and say, hey, hindsight's 2020 if I bought that. It's not about that. And that's why I do think a lot of cards are going to start dropping in price because, some people over leverage themselves and they realize, hey, these cards are dropping. They start selling them. They're quiet. There's a quiet period. So, these lessons are very important when it comes to collectibles because, there is a lot of learning that happens. Now, the third prediction is expect older cards to grow in popularity. One thing about older Pokemon cards that needs to be understood by a lot of collectors is their pop reports. Now, pop reports don't mean everything, but they mean enough. And what this means is that a lot of the modern cards you're seeing, most of these cards now, the special illustration rares and all the new cards that are coming out, a lot of them are exceeding PSA 10 pop reports of over 10,000, okay? There's so many cards, right? When we look at vintage, a lot of these cards have pop reports. Some cards, right, PSA 10 of vintage, they're under 100. And what's crazy is some of these cards that have under 100 of PSA 10 pop reports are, matching prices of cards that have over 10,000. And that is so weird, and there's a bit of a disconnection point here. And I think older cards will start growing more in price, not just vintage cards from base set and what people think, but even cards from the black-white era, a lot of cards from XY. You also have to think how Pokemon works in cycles. Mega Evolution cards before Pokemon Legends ZA came out and before anyone even knew anything about Mega Pokemon were returning to the TCG, they were super cheap. Most people could have bought every single Mega Evolution card from the XY era for, like dirt cheap. Right now, that's not the case. Now Mega Evolution, we're in this new Mega Evolution era. People really like the old Mega Evolution cards. And, were people able to predict that? That's why you do have to expect that older cards will continue to grow. And, it depends what you define an older card. I think the word vintage now kind of means for, your base set, probably from 1999, probably the whole Wizard of the Coast era. I would say that is what kind of encapsulates a vintage card. And then I don't even know if we have a term in the community for what would be after that. I mean, right now I'm just calling them older cards. I don't really like that because, like we probably should all, agree on a name of what we want to call these eras of cards. But in saying that, I do think these cards, outside of vintage, but before kind of like, Sun and Moon as well, that period from Ruby Sapphire to XY, there is a lot of interesting cards in this era. And I do expect that there's going to be more popularity for these, especially as a lot of those people who collected those also start getting older and start researching the cards from their childhood. Most people who collected as kids, and they remember the chase cards from their childhood. And then the big thing they do is they kind of revisit these cards. Now, the fourth prediction is expect prices to stabilize across the board. Now, I know I mentioned that a lot of chase cards are going to be coming down in price, or they're going to stabilize a lot, but I do think Pokemon cards in general will stabilize in 2026. The reason for this is because there's been too much growth, too much new things have happened, and I do think, Pokemon has had definitely enough time to kind of catch up and play catch up with what's happened. Even though a lot of people are entering the hobby, you have to remember the printing demands and how many people want certain cards is increasing. I've actually learned, and from running this channel, one thing I've actually noticed is I feel a lot of newcomers get very excited about certain sets or certain cards, but they don't have the history with the knowledge. And so what they do is they can sometimes get overexcited about certain cards or, certain products. And this can create a little bit more hype than what's really deserved. And I think that was one of the issues that we saw within the last few years, is that because so many people were entering, so many people wanted the certain chase cards, everyone wanted, one particular card, and especially now, right? I mean, we live in this new modern age where information is lightning fast. So if something starts spiking in price, you're getting that information within like seconds to you. If a new Pokemon card just starts breaking price records, including myself on the channel, I'll start talking about that price spike. I'll be like, wow, guys, can you believe this? Look what's happening. And that happens across the whole board, whether it be on all social medias, people start hyping certain cards, and the access to information has made prices really spike really quickly. But of course, also when prices drop, the same thing happens because a lot of people, especially content creators, can look at prices dropping, they kind of inform their audience, and then more and more people start making content about it, more eyes kind of enter the hobby. It's just a big growing cycle of what's to happen. But like I said, I do think prices will stabilize within 2026. But with all that said, I think a question that comes up is, how do you actually collect Pokemon cards on a budget? And I do speak about that in this video here. Within this video on screen, I actually go in detail how to collect Pokemon cards on a budget. If you enjoyed this video, click the video that's appearing right now on screen. I appreciate you watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.